They say the past never dies, but sometimes it hides, deep enough that only the brave or the damned ever find it. The story I'm about to tell you isn't a myth or a fable whispered in the corners of history. It's real. It happened. And it's one of the most disturbing cases of human innocence shattered by the cruel weight of circumstance. It begins not in a war zone, not in a broken city, but in a small, sun-bleached village high in the mountains of Peru. There, in 1939, a young girl, too young even to understand the meaning of motherhood, was taken to a hospital by her terrified parents. Her belly was swollen round and growing. The villagers whispered curses. They thought she had been touched by the spirits, or maybe punished by God. But the truth was far darker than superstition could ever explain. Her name was Lina Medina. She was 5 years old, and she was 7 months pregnant. Doctors didn't believe it at first. They thought it was a tumor, a freak condition, something medical textbooks couldn't explain. But X-rays told the truth no one was ready to accept. Inside her small, fragile body, a baby was forming, heartbeat steady, movement alive, and the doctors, men hardened by science and war, felt something in them break. They were witnessing the impossible. In May of that year, Lina was rushed into surgery. The delivery was difficult, but she survived. So did the baby boy. She named him Gerardo, after the doctor who delivered him. And in that sterile hospital room, surrounded by white walls and whispering horror, a 5-year-old child became the youngest confirmed mother in human history. But the story doesn't end there. Because while newspapers around the world feasted on the shock, while photographers begged for a glimpse of the miracle child, no one asked the question that mattered most: how did it happen? Who did this to her? That question would open a door no one wanted to walk through. A door that led into the darkest corners of family, silence, and the things humanity hides to protect its own sickness. They tried to make sense of it. The doctors, the priests, the journalists, they all wanted to wrap the story in reason, in some explanation that made it less monstrous. But there wasn't one. Lina's body had matured abnormally fast, what medical journals later called precocious puberty. Her bones, her organs, her blood, they carried the marks of a woman far older than 5. Yet her face remained that of a child, wide-eyed, frightened, silent. When authorities pressed her parents for answers, the truth became even murkier. Her father, a poor craftsman named Tiburcio, was immediately arrested. People said it had to be him. Who else could have access to the child? Who else could have caused something so unnatural? But there was no proof, no confession, no witnesses, and the little girl, too young to even understand the word violation, said nothing. She couldn't or wouldn't. Weeks turned into months. The investigators came and went. Newspapers printed sensational headlines, twisting her tragedy into a curiosity for the world to gawk at. The baby mother of Peru, one headline read, as though it were a carnival act instead of a cry for justice. Foreign doctors arrived with cameras, not compassion. Scientists called her a biological anomaly, reducing her suffering to a case study in human development. But behind those hospital doors, behind the polished glass of the medical records, there was something else, a silence so heavy it felt like guilt. Lina never named anyone. Her family vanished from public view, retreating to the same mountain village they'd come from, as if to bury the story under the dust of time. The father, after months of suspicion, was released without charges. The world moved on. But evil doesn't disappear just because people stop looking. The truth has a way of lingering, in the dark, in whispers, in the hearts of those who can't forget what they saw. And this story wasn't over. Decades later, when Lina grew into adulthood, questions began to resurface. Who was the father of her child? What happened to that child? And why did the people who knew the answers stay silent until their dying breath? Sometimes, the cruelest stories are not the ones the world tells, but the ones a family keeps. As the years passed, the world lost interest in Lina Medina. The headlines faded. The doctors who once called her a marvel grew old, their reports gathering dust in hospital archives. But for Lina, the silence never ended. It only deepened. She grew up raising her son as though he were her little brother. The villagers didn't speak of it, but their eyes always did. The kind of eyes that remember a sin even when the mouth denies it. Gerardo, her child, grew into a bright boy. He believed Lina was his sister. She never told him otherwise, not until much later, when the truth could no longer hide. By then, he was 10 years old enough to understand words but not their weight, old enough to see the pain behind his mother's quietness. When he learned who she really was, something in their fragile world cracked open. The hospital records showed that Gerardo was healthy, intelligent, and affectionate. But the doctors noted something else too, a strange sadness that lingered in his eyes, a heaviness that mirrored his mother's. Perhaps he had inherited more than just her blood. Perhaps trauma, too, can pass from one generation to the next, unseen but alive. Lina refused interviews for decades. She declined money, refused exploitation, and vanished into a life of silence. It wasn't humility, it was survival. In her town, she was both a miracle and a curse. The women whispered her name like an omen. The men avoided her eyes. Every birth, every child's laughter, must have reminded her of the day she became a mother without ever being allowed to be a child. And then came the cruelest chapter. Gerardo, the boy born from the impossible, died at the age of 40. Bone disease, they said, natural causes. But Lina never spoke of it publicly. She buried him quietly, just as she had buried her past. To this day, she has never named the man responsible for her pregnancy. Whether out of fear, protection, or something darker, we will never know. In the end, what remained was not just one child's stolen innocence, but the collective guilt of a world that turned horror into spectacle and tragedy into entertainment. Because sometimes, the monsters aren't hiding in the shadows. They're standing in plain sight, and everyone just agrees not to look. When we look back at stories like Lina's, it's easy to treat them as distant history, an echo from another world, a place where superstition ruled and justice was just a word. But that illusion is comforting, isn't it? It lets us believe we've changed, that we've evolved past the cruelty of exploitation and silence. The truth, though, is far less merciful, because Lina's story isn't just about one child. It's about the machinery of power that preys on the weak, then buries the evidence beneath respectability. Her body became a battleground between curiosity and conscience. Doctors studied her like a specimen. Journalists sold her pain as front-page spectacle. The government called it mystery, when it was clearly a crime, and the world moved on because it's easier to name a miracle than to admit to a horror. Decades later, when researchers revisited the case, they found that some medical files had vanished. Photographs were destroyed. Witnesses contradicted one another. It was as though someone wanted the truth erased, or perhaps rewritten into something less damning. Even her son's paternity test, which could have revealed everything, was never performed. Coincidence or convenience? Some say her father's arrest and release were staged to quiet the scandal. Others whisper that someone with influence, someone outside the family, was protected. In small communities, power doesn't always wear a crown. Sometimes it wears a uniform, a collar, or a friendly smile. And so the questions linger. Was Lina the victim of one man, or of an entire culture that saw her as property? A society that refused to see the unbearable truth because it didn't fit its sense of morality? We'll never know for certain. But one thing is clear. When innocence meets silence, silence wins. The story of the world's youngest mother isn't just a medical anomaly. It's a mirror. A reflection of how easily humanity trades compassion for curiosity and justice for comfort. The image of Lina as a child, holding her baby in that black and white photograph, isn't just unsettling. It's accusing. It's the gaze of history asking every one of us, what did you expect to see when you looked? A miracle, or the evidence of our collective failure? In the years that followed, Lina tried to live a life that resembled normalcy. She found work at the same hospital where her tragedy had once been dissected. She walked the same halls where men in white coats had whispered about her like a myth. And still, she kept her head low, her past unspoken. Those who met her described her as quiet, almost spectral, as if she existed between two worlds, the living and the remembered. Her son, Gerardo, was raised with care. For years, she shielded him from the truth. They lived together, ate together, laughed sometimes, but beneath every moment lay a shadow neither could name. When Gerardo finally learned the truth, he didn't hate her, he pitied her. Because even as a child, he must have sensed that his existence was the echo of a crime no one dared to confront. There's something haunting about the photographs that survive. In one, Lina stands stiffly beside her son, her expression unreadable. It's not joy, not grief, something colder. Resignation, maybe. The kind of look only people who've seen too much can carry. The photo appeared in medical journals for decades, stripped of context, used to teach doctors about precocious puberty, but not about trauma. They studied her body, never her pain. The world loves to forget the victims it cannot categorize. It's easier that way, easier to file her under medical mystery than to face what really happened. That a child was hurt, used, and then immortalized as an anomaly instead of a survivor. She was turned into data, a living wound disguised as a discovery. Even today, Lina refuses interviews. She never sought money, fame, or pity. She asks only for privacy. That, perhaps, is her final act of defiance, denying the world the spectacle it so desperately craves. But the story continues to circle back, decade after decade, whispered through documentaries, podcasts, and now, this very video. Every time it's told, we peel another layer away, but we also reopen the wound. Because this isn't just about Lina, it's about us. About what we choose to see and what we choose to ignore. They say time heals all wounds. But time doesn't heal what the world refuses to acknowledge. It only buries it deeper, layer after layer, until the truth becomes folklore, and the cries of a child sound like echoes from a dream. Lina's story has become exactly that, a whisper between generations, told not to comfort, but to haunt. When historians revisit her case, they face a silence that feels almost deliberate. Government archives are empty where records should exist. Photographs have been lost or misfiled. Interviews that once existed on tape are gone. Some say the Peruvian government wanted to preserve the country's reputation at the time. Others say religious institutions had a hand in keeping the story quiet, protecting the idea of faith over the ugliness of fact. But every missing page feels like a confession. Every empty file folder feels like someone's trembling hand turning the key on a locked door. And yet, the story refuses to die. Because somewhere in that silence, there's a truth that cannot be erased. Maybe Lina knew who hurt her. Maybe she didn't. Maybe she was told to forget, or maybe she chose to, because remembering would destroy her. We don't know. We never will. But we know this: for a 5-year-old to become pregnant, someone had to take something that could never be returned. It's the kind of horror humanity can't stand to face, so it calls it a miracle. That's how society protects itself. When the truth is unbearable, it rewrites the story into something holy, something strange, something beyond comprehension. That's what happened here. Lina Medina became a medical marvel, a trivia fact, a historical anomaly. But behind that label, there was a child who never got to be one. The most terrifying thing about this story isn't what happened to her. It's how easily the world moved on. How a civilization capable of sending men to the moon couldn't find justice for a child who gave birth before she lost her baby teeth. That's not history. That's humanity, stripped bare. And when you realize that, you start to wonder how many other Linas there were. How many stories were erased. How many girls disappeared into silence, simply because their truth made the world uncomfortable. There's a point in every dark story when the horror stops being about what happened and starts being about what we allowed. Lina's life, stripped of its mystery and myth, forces us to face that point. She wasn't chosen by fate or cursed by nature. She was failed by her family, by her country, and by the world that turned her pain into a headline. Imagine being 5 years old and carrying a child inside you. The confusion, the fear, the pain. She couldn't have understood what was happening to her. She couldn't have understood why her mother wept in corners, or why strange men with notebooks came to prod and measure her. The world didn't protect her. It observed her. It studied her like an experiment, while the real question, the one that mattered, was left unanswered. And perhaps that's the cruelest truth of all. Humanity has always been fascinated by suffering, as long as it belongs to someone else. We look at tragedy and call it extraordinary. We give it names: the youngest mother, the miracle girl, so we can tell ourselves it's something rare, something that couldn't happen again. But it can, it does, every day in silence. By the time Lina reached adulthood, she had learned to wear that silence like armor. She never spoke of her father again, never spoke of her son's origins. She never even told the world where she buried him. Her silence wasn't weakness. It was the only power she had left, a way to hold on to something that hadn't been taken from her. And yet, even in silence, the truth breathes. Every time someone rediscovers her story, every time her name is whispered, the world is reminded of what it did, of what it failed to do. Lina is more than a tragedy, she's a mirror. one that shows us what happens when innocence meets indifference, when justice hides behind shame, and when a child's suffering is too uncomfortable to believe. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments. What would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have fought for the truth or buried it to survive? As Lina aged, her life became a quiet protest against everything the world had done to her. She never sought fame, though she could have sold her story 100 times over. She never chased pity, though she had earned the right to it more than anyone alive. Instead, she chose obscurity, a silence so complete it became almost holy. Because for someone whose body had once been stolen by the world, keeping her story to herself was the only way to reclaim ownership of it. But silence, too, has its cost. In interviews decades later, her relatives described her as gentle but distant. She spoke little, smiled rarely, and seemed to carry the weight of 2 lifetimes behind her eyes. Her neighbors said she would sometimes walk to the edge of the town and stare at the mountains, standing there for hours. Maybe she was looking for peace. Maybe she was talking to the child she had once been, the one who never got to grow up. Gerardo's grave remains unmarked. No stone, no inscription. Just a patch of earth where the past sleeps, waiting for those who dare to remember. Some say she visits it every year. Others say she stopped long ago, choosing instead to let time erase what the world never deserved to know. But the truth is that Lina's story can never truly be buried. It lives on in the pages of medical journals, in the archives of forgotten newspapers, and in the uneasy hearts of those who stumble upon it. People like you, it's easy to turn away, to say, that was long ago, or that could never happen here. But that's the same lie the world told itself in 1939, and it's the same lie we keep telling today. Because the moment we stop looking, it happens again. Different faces, different names, same silence. The story of the world's youngest mother isn't just about a girl in Peru. It's about what happens when innocence collides with apathy, when truth is so unbearable that we choose myth instead. Lina's life stands as a quiet accusation, a scar on the conscience of humanity. And in the end, maybe that's what makes her story truly terrifying. Not what was done to her, but what we, collectively, chose not to do. There's an image that stays with you long after the facts fade. A photograph, grainy and cold, showing a little girl with a child in her arms. Her eyes are dark, hollow, too still for someone so young. That single image has traveled the world, passed from hand to hand, stripped of her name, her pain, her humanity. People share it in shock, in disbelief, in morbid curiosity, but few stop to think about what they're really looking at. It's not a miracle, it's evidence. Evidence of a wound that civilization inflicted, then refused to treat. Lina Medina's story is the kind history tries to wash clean, the kind that makes people uncomfortable at dinner tables. Yet, that's exactly why it must be remembered, because every time a society buries its sins, the earth beneath it grows darker. Every unspoken truth becomes another ghost whispering through the cracks of memory. Some say her story proves the resilience of the human body, but maybe it proves something far more sinister, the resilience of human denial. How far we'll go to pretend innocence can survive violation. How quickly we'll turn horror into science and a victim into a specimen. There are few traces left of Lina now. Her family still lives quietly in Peru. She's in her 90s, still refusing interviews, still protecting the silence that once protected her. And maybe she's right too, because after everything, the world hasn't earned her words. It hasn't earned her truth. But we can still learn from her shadow. We can remember that the world's youngest mother wasn't a marvel of biology. She was a monument to everything that can go wrong when compassion is replaced by curiosity. When a child's suffering becomes a public fascination instead of a rallying cry. As you finish this story, remember, the past doesn't die. It waits, it watches, and sometimes it asks to be seen again, not for answers, but for acknowledgement. The story of Lina Medina isn't a mystery to solve. It's a mirror. And if you dare to look closely enough, you might see the truth about the world and about yourself staring back.